Hi everyone, I'm Gary Null. I'd like to welcome you to this program. Today, an original in-depth investigative report on a very important issue, psychiatry's racial bias against the African American community. Now, many people would suggest, well, that's not possible. Psychiatrists are at the forefront of trying to help people understand their biases and prejudices, to bring out from their subconscious mind those words or actions that end up precipitating a violence against any group, whether African American or any other. How could they be the perpetrators? Well, I ask you this question. What if in the basic beliefs of an entire system of education there has been a flaw that has not been properly recognized and has continued to be perpetuated? What if we pass on these biases very subtly, not overtly, not where you're thinking about what is wrong with a person who is of a different color, but rather things that you have grown up accepting without challenge. In effect, you become hardwired to this. Today I'm going to take you on a tour, a historical tour, to let you see just how insidious this is and where it originated. I'll be quoting verbatim from Dr. Mark Barber and others who have spent a great deal of time and research in this field from my own experience as well. Most African Americans think that the psychiatrist is there primarily to help with people who are emotionally imbalanced. This is far from the reality. In fact, we're going to take a look right now. And I'm going to take a look at psychiatrists who involuntarily commit African Americans 300 to 500% more often than they do whites. Psychiatrists diagnose African American men in public and private mental hospitals as having schizophrenia at a rate of up to 1,500% higher than white men. Yet there is no biological basis for this. There is no hard evidence for this. There is no scientific criteria for it. And how in the world could it happen? African Americans are given significantly higher doses of psychiatric drugs. We're talking major selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, neuroleptics, tranquilizers than whites. More than 200% more African Americans as whites are classified as mentally retarded. This silent and persistent psychiatric lobby has provided the ways and means for this assault through legitimate laws and mental health and involuntary commitment laws, sterilization acts, and special education laws. Psychiatry, heavily financed by the National Institutes of Mental Health, along with its community mental health centers, began in 1963, and they have been destructive in the oppression of many African Americans. And it's done through the community health centers. They provided numerous frontline sales outlets operating within the fabric of society, right under all the noses of the Democrats who've supported and sponsored it, and the Republicans. At the end of it, however, is a long line of unwitting victims, and the growth of this network parallels the declining statistics among African Americans. I'll just give you one example. William, a young African American, is a stark example of psychiatry's approach to mental health. William lost his job and was worried about how he was going to support himself. He couldn't read or write. He visited a local community mental health center to talk to someone about it. Instead of listening to him, the psychiatrist asked stereotypical questions about whether he abused his girlfriend, whether he felt angry. He raised his voice in frustration. Within minutes, the psychiatrist had called in 2 men to involuntarily admit William to a psychiatric institution. He was held for 3 days against his will and was forcibly injected with a major tranquilizer. For the first 2 days, the main question asked of William was whether he had any insurance. He was told that if he wanted help, he would need to pay. William had no money. 2 hours later, the psychiatrist interviewed him and suddenly found him fit to be released. When it was found he had no insurance and no money. Before he was discharged, William was told to sign a paper that he couldn't read. He was later told that this form identified the hospital and the psychiatrist. It said that he had been fully informed about the drugs prescribed to him and he willingly agreed to take them. This is not an isolated case. It is typical everywhere in America of how easy it is for psychiatrists using fraudulent diagnosis and repressive mental health laws to incarcerate African Americans. So-called scientific research on the African American has been extensively funded by the taxpayers' dollars through the National Institute of Mental Health. The waste of taxpayer money on absurd and ridiculous studies is a scandal. Millions of dollars that could have gone to workable inner-city programs for African Americans. For example, over the last 31 years, Harvard University researchers have been given $2.3 million to torture rhesus monkeys while they were under the influence of mind-altering drugs. Over $4 million has been spent on 3 other studies to determine violent or sexual behavior of monkeys, rats, and castrated quail. At the same time, the National Institute of Mental Health planned a $50 million study to investigate whether any inner-city youth, especially African Americans, had a violent gene, which, if isolated, could be controlled by psychiatric drugs. The bias was clear. If you're black, if you're poor, and in the inner city, you must have a gene. We'll find the gene. Here's $50 million to study the black violent child, which assumes that all children who are poor in the inner city who are black are violent. But what about the African American children from middle class and upper middle class and wealthy families? Well, here's the miracle psychiatry's logic. They somehow didn't get the same gene. Only poor blacks and ghettos did. In fact, in 1963, the National Institute of Health established and funded community mental health centers after the director, the top man at the National Institute of Mental Health, convinced Congress that, quote, a bold new approach to the problem of mental illness was needed. The institutionalization of drugs. At the same time, African Americans were fighting to secure civil rights. Community mental health programs are being implemented behind the scenes, and the results have been a catastrophe. African American adolescents between the ages of 13 and 17 are forced into community health centers. 55% of outpatients visiting one of these centers receives a psychiatric mind-altering drug. The suicide rate since the establishment of these centers has risen 125% in adolescents between 15 and 19. Nowhere is the evidence of the intended psychiatric coercion more obvious than in the educational programs which have been introduced into our schools since the 1960s. Here's what's happening to one 8-year-old African American child after a values clarification class. Donna, an African American mother of 8-year-old Joey, said her son was part of a special education program where children were taught about problem solving. He was shown a film which depicted a young boy trying to kill himself by tying a rope around his neck in order to hang himself. In the film, the boy talks about not being liked at school, being teased, and worrying about growing up. Donna knew nothing about this program, nor the school curriculum, because it didn't mention anything other than just social studies. 2 days later, after her son watched the video, Donna walked into his room and found him hanging by a rope by his bunk bed. Over half of the 5 million African American public school students are in special education programs where psychiatrists or psychologists have diagnosed 38% of them as, quote, educationally mentally retarded. More than 18% of them diagnosed as seriously emotionally disturbed. You're dealing with 50%. Many children diagnosed with either of these are placed on powerful antidepressants that act as tranquilizers. The arrest rate of African Americans under the age of 18 for drug abuse violations increased 2,900% in just a 20-year period. That's 5 times higher than the arrest rate for whites. When faced with the truth, African Americans have risen to override all obstacles. This was seen when the Violence Initiative became known in 1992. When they rose up to foil psychiatrists' attempt to gain more funding from the National Institute of Mental Health to experiment on and drug 100,000 inner-city youth, African Americans formed the Committee to Stop the Federal Violence Initiative, and through efforts of the community, working shoulder to shoulder with other concerned groups, they defeated the plan. How did we get here? How did we get to where we're doing all this to the children, stigmatizing them and saying that African American women are more susceptible to schizophrenia? There's no proof of any of this, yet there's been no question to challenge it either. Let us take now a very detailed look at the history of psychiatry's bias against African Americans. It was William Tuttman Ph.D., co-founder of the Committee to Stop